recording, but so it'll see you if you're here. If you move around a lot, you'll go up to camera. You.
We're both mad.
Good.
I'll be so stupid.
You feel so good.
I know. I said to somebody, I was over here and I left early and I just said, I'm going to go see somebody I haven't seen in person in 2 years.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yes,
It's feeling so good to be close. Like, are we gonna have a white nose for a week?
I think so. Maybe. Will I be allowed to go? That's the next question.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. really.
Well, if they have it, if the feds have it.
Yeah, it seems
Yeah.
like, yeah. I hope. It'll be nice if we can. What a great place to be in June. Oh, no.
Yeah. I mean,
Oh,
I will see you.
yeah, make sure I know how to do it.
So if you, so I did it on this, we're sharing the screen so you can go to the full screen here whenever you're ready. And if you'll still be here in the corner, this controls the pan. See,
Oh,
I'm gonna about that. When I pay attention, and then the microphones, the people are hearing you here, hanging from the side. And we can ask people to do their comments or questions in the chat box. I think that I can hide the video camera.
I don't think it's necessary for me if I know where I need to stay, like not go too far over here.
Okay.
That's fine. And I can't use presenter view, right? Because of, yeah, because they'll see that.
Correct. Yeah.
That's what I think it's fine.
All right. So I'm going to. I found this.
So much. That's cyber stuff.
So that's what worked in the fall semester. I will leave,
That's been better.
you can't necessarily.
So like roller coaster, you know, it's like it starts with the letters, and then I do more.
I
I
got
mean,
to be back on the field. I mean, you know, I had a great day. I love being out there, but you and I came out.
I'm not
Shippensburg, right?
Yeah, I'm all done.
And we made an agreement. Based on
Which is a lot of work.
So you got a lot of writing to do.
Now we'll just go to the screen.
Yeah, busy. And I see.
This does not advance these slides, the only way.
A lot of writing, a lot of
There are
reading.
more.
That's not great.
Is it a-
Single one, they said, need one with the two, no, these said they
Like
got
at
one
first
with
I
the
was
two.
like.
Have you not
great,
just
like,
saved it
I
in a
really
folder?
thought
And
about
do you
it.
want to?
Then after a couple
That's where
months,
you
yeah,
have
like,
I don't
I
Yeah.
don't think it-
Yeah, I'll take it.
I know, right? Hello.
I know.
I
Jessica.
showed them some more things this morning.
Yeah.
I know you did it.
It'll be there.
So next, so it's just-
Well, that's when I sent them last night.
I'll send it again.
Okay, so I probably have that.
I have to take the film.
So do you want me to forward it to you? You know what you need? What is it? Or what is it?
No, I don't. All the ones.
And I said, sure.
Zoe, that's one I hired was a lab technician and
I didn't know she doesn't provide nature. So now
But she's still
now I'm the
undergrad,
deputy
maybe?
official.
No,
I thought.
Really?
she had graduated in December before she was a
I is
part-time.
the issuing.
And then she had an internship with the DNR in Tammy. And that ended,
Was it your original?
she got hired.
They
by-
were-
I don't think that
Yeah,
Yeah, she got hired. by-
yeah. This part.
Oh, I haven't seen you for a while. He's gonna shoot his backpack.
No.
And then when Dad owned it, they were like, and then like going by the grocery concerts. You know, especially for you. Nobody cares. But she's doing it. I would say downtown Athens has like a split. I feel like it's funding comes out of like football crowd, separate. The math are all over the place. You just knew where to be. I had a
So I had,
We have.
Oh, yeah, we're they want us in there. Yesterday, no one went. So it's like, and they stopped even on that. They're like, oh, I was like, nobody's here tonight. And people was like, oh, everybody down the road. I'm like, yeah, I didn't know. Yeah, that's why it is. I'm like, okay, well, and I mean, we don't know. I assume most of the people in our building are vaccinated.
How is it being a grad student?
It's different. It's different being a student again.
It's just normal stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's,
Now it's normal.
I
You don't get more?
Yeah, that's what my friends are working on. They have it down there. I worked up the.
She told us like our 3:30.
Oh, really? It was later. I mean, I think we were.
Dude, I just bought a basketball yesterday, and I went to go shoot at the church. Yeah, that's gonna catch you with my.
Yeah.
It's just it's kind of a shitty hoop. You should find somewhere else.
I was thinking about scouting.
Yeah, I didn't know what to do. Like, I'll teach you.
Yeah, oh. I'm like typing in my hands.
What? I know they got it. They do call them the beers.
Apologize if I didn't guide. But
And then.
Someone said,
How long?
When I started.
Yeah, my link to.
Yeah, I think so.
What did I do?
Yeah, I know, well, I don't know about that. I had to do it, because I really, I'm a big one.
Yeah. Yeah, because I moved
Yeah.
out here.
I love like the.
She's my sister.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
That's good. I'm very.
Back up. Row.
Hey, welcome to the first NRGSA speaker of this semester, spring 2022. We have sent the flyer with a lineup around. We have no one next week, but then after that, pretty much every week till the end of the semester. So without further ado, we'll begin.
Thank you for coming, and thank you for those on the internet joining us. A reminder to mute cell phones. It's my pleasure today to introduce Katrina Morris from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources. So Trina got her bachelor's degree from Purdue University. How many Boilermakers here? One.
Really?
All right. And her master's degree from Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania. And she was an ecologist for the Nature Conservancy for 2 years before moving to the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, where you've been there for almost 17 years now. So I know a lot of my students in undergraduate and graduate are excited to talk to you about career paths and things later on. But you've been doing a lot of work. I know you mostly from bats and skunks and things, but you do a lot of research on wildlife around the state. And I also know that you were SBDN past president. So you've been very active regionally in addition to this thing. So with that, I'll turn it over to you for your talk.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I want to talk to you about a subject that has just popped up in the news. Did anybody hear the NPR article yesterday about the transportation bill and money for wildlife? Did you hear that? So I'll talk about some of that today, and it wasn't planned. I mean, I didn't really think about this because of that, but suddenly there's all kinds of action. So it's really good timing that I'm talking about transportation. I am not a transportation ecologist. That's the first thing I want to tell you, because that's a real thing. Like, you can be a transportation ecologist if you didn't know that. I have done a lot of different stuff, and as David said, a lot of people know me from recent work with bats and other small mammals, but I've been really lucky in my career to work with a lot of different things, even since I came to Georgia DNR in 2005. And I've started doing a lot more with transportation, and it really made me think that I didn't know anything about what transportation work involved when I was in undergrad or grad school, and I didn't really do much with it until I came here. So I wanted to give you a little introduction about how agencies work with DOTs first, and about our agency specifically. Now, we're in South Carolina. Every state agency is set up differently, but in Georgia DNR, we have 6 divisions, and they are like, we're separate from Parks. So Parks does different things than us, even though we work with them. Same with law enforcement. So I'm in the Wildlife Resources Division, and that division is the one that is taking care of wildlife, right, and wild places, including non-game animals, which is what my focus is and what my section works on. we used to be called the non-game conservation section, but that's kind of a bad name. So we changed it to the wildlife conservation section. And we work on wildlife and habitats, and that includes plants through education, research, and management. And just to help you understand how these things got started, non-game wildlife has not been a big focus for a lot of state agencies. And our heritage program staff started in the 80s, but really the 90s was when we established as a heritage program, which is the old name for non-game wildlife programs. And you can see they started out pretty small. Believe it or not, I started my work in this trailer before we actually built a building that we work in now. This is a more recent photo of our section. So we've had a lot of growth, and this is fairly common for non-game wildlife because there's been more of a focus. Now, keep in mind, even though this looks like a lot of people, this is for the entire state of Georgia, and about half of our staff is seasonal. So we really don't have a ton of full-time staff, but a whole lot more than we used to. And all of our work is based on the strategy we put together and the State Wildlife Action Plan. And if you guys don't know, most state agencies, their non-game programs don't get state appropriation. So we don't get money like Game and Fish for our work. We have to write a lot of grants for what we do. And one of the big things that, well, really the main thing that we use to write these grants is the State Wildlife Action Plan. So the first one was done in 2005. We updated it in 2015. We've got another update in 25. And that basically establishes everything we're going to do. Like if you have a species that's in this plan, then you can work on it using grants through state wildlife grants. And so every state has to have a plan so that when you get a grant, you have something to do with that money. And you can see that we have a lot of species that we focus on. The Southeast is very diverse, so that's common. And we really, it's actually a plan that works. It's not one of those things that sits on a shelf that people don't use. Like this really guides the work that we do. And that's important because Georgia is a big state and it's mostly private land. It's the largest state east of the Mississippi River. And just to give you an idea about our population, compared to South Carolina's, we're at about 10.8 million, which is the 12th fastest growing. That changes a lot, but we're growing pretty fast. You guys are actually growing faster right now. You have about half the population. Obviously, you're smaller, but we're seeing really quick growth in the Southeast. So I'm sure you guys learn a lot about the changes on the landscape and how much population is changing. I'm going to focus mostly on how that affects transportation issues. We have over 125,000 miles of roadways. That includes interstate, state, and county roads in Georgia. And that means 317 million vehicle miles traveled every day. That is a lot. And it's hard to even imagine that. And that means obviously that transportation is having a major impact on wildlife in a lot of different ways. Those impacts can be direct. In this case, roadway widening that caused maintenance that wiped out a species of plant that was on the roadway that nobody knew about. So just an example of direct impacts to wildlife. But you can also have some indirect impacts that you might not think about. So when we're reviewing transportation projects, we look not just at the actual project. Say you're putting in a new interchange on an interstate. That's a specific area of impact where that work is going to be done. But there's additional impact that come with that. I don't know if you guys have been traveling much lately, but if you're around the Southeast, you've probably seen signs for Buc-ee's. This is a new Buc-ee's. We have a new one on I-75 North. We have one on 75 South. And I heard there's going to be one here between Atlanta and Greenville, I guess. I don't know, on 85 somewhere, but they're popping up everywhere. And I think this one has like 160 something gas pumps. Like it's insane. It's the Walmart of gas stations. It's huge. And with this, obviously comes a lot of vehicles. There'll come extra things. There'll be more things built up just because that one interchange was added to the interstate. All these things pop up around it. So the actual impact of these transportation changes is much more than just the footprint of the actual work. And so we actually have ecology staff at Georgia DOT that work on these issues. And there's a lot of staff up above here that don't really care much for ecology, but they have to deal with it. But we're lucky in Georgia in that we have a lot of dedicated staff that work on ecology that are actually DOT employees and contractors. And these people are the ones that we directly communicate with early in the process and throughout the transportation work to figure out what ecological impacts are likely to happen and how we might be able to lessen those. Now, I said we're lucky because we have a lot of staff and they are really good staff. I'm sure South Carolina staff is really good, but generally they just don't have the resources. And this might not be exactly accurate, but I tried to pull everyone out that seemed like they had some time. My counterpart in South Carolina is always complaining about not having as good communication and results. That's probably because they just don't have the capacity. And that's really the more common situation in the Southeast. So we do have a long history of working with our Department of Transportation since the 80s. This is a screenshot from our biodiversity portal, which is a way that you can look at information about our high priority species and habitats online. It's the information we use to review any projects to see if we have any records nearby. We're constantly updating our database so that we have current records to work on these reviews. We didn't have a lot of staff, obviously, early on to do this work, and that's what I actually moved to Georgia to start as an environmental review biologist. I was the only one reviewing every project in Georgia, and so I clearly couldn't engage very well and really get into the projects. So in 2014, we worked with DOT to establish a funding source, hire more biologists, and expand the program. And we were able to actually pay our current wildlife biologists for their time to give like expert advice on how to reduce impacts on their species that they work with. And we can work on more special projects. We do have to respond more promptly to DOT, but we're actually able to do it because we were able to add staff. So it's helped us to review projects more quickly and then focus on the ones that are likely to have more of an impact. And we can really go in depth on some of the problems. And I'll talk a little bit more on some of the issues that we've worked on that are more complex. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go into boring details about this joint coordination procedures, but just to understand how the regulations work, Georgia DNR is not a regulatory agency. So when we provide information and we get recommendations, that's really all we can do. If we really need to get law enforcement to step in, we can, but that's rare. We really depend on Fish and Wildlife Service and Federal Highway Administration to say, these are the laws you have to follow, so you have to do this. And so that's kind of what gets DOT to do stuff. And then we are able to actually get them to pay attention, not only to federally listed species, but state listed species, as well as those species of concern that are not necessarily listed. And that's big, and not every state has that kind of relationship. And our reviews start with an online tool that's on an ArcGIS platform. Again, this is like the boring part, right? Where we have to go in and look at our rare species data, figure out what's in the area. And we basically do a search. So if the blue square was your environmental review area where you're going to have some kind of impact, then the big black rectangle is that 3-mile buffer for terrestrial species. And then we buffer at the Hook 10 level for aquatics. So we're giving them a list of everything that might be within the project area, and we're giving them exact locations of anything that is within the project area so they can go try to find it. And we provide them with this information in a letter and then provide recommendations for how to avoid impacts. And that oftentimes and almost always includes surveys for high priority species. You may start with a desktop review of looking at the data, but then you're going to go out in the field and figure out what the habitat's like, what's going to be impacted, and what are the likely impacts to the high priority species that could be on site. So we may help with surveys. In particular cases, we may go out and help survey, especially if it's a species that is really rare and needs experts to identify. But we've also helped to give them the information they need to do better surveys on their own. So most of the time, DOT hires environmental consultants to do these surveys. And some of you guys might get jobs at consulting firms when you get out of school. And one of the big things that you would do is review these transportation projects and other large developments. You'll go out and do a survey and look for habitat, and then you might look for specific species. And this manual gives people an idea of what time of year for what species, what kinds of things you need to do when you're looking for them, and just general guidelines that are more specific so that they know what we expect if they're going to go out and do a survey. And that's made their surveys a lot more effective and made us kind of trust that information a lot more. So if you find areas within right of way, you want to do something to protect them. In Georgia, a long time ago, someone established these ESAs. I don't know what that little person is on the sign. And it's very confusing because until a couple of years ago, I thought this was an Endangered Species Act. Like clearly there's a federal species somewhere nearby. I don't know what this dude is doing, but like, and I have no idea what it is when I'm driving down the road. That's all I see. Well, it turns out DOT doesn't know either. And somebody just said, if there's something rare there, stick a sign in the ground and then we've done our job. Well, not really, because nobody knows what to do. And this really is a problem. We don't have a list of species within the right of way. So we're trying to work with them to actually get a list and to develop management plans for those species that are there. So if you have a rare plant that can't be mowed at a certain time of the year, you probably need to have some information about that so people know what to do when they're maintaining the roadway. We also need to make sure if these old records that we haven't visited in a while are still there, or maybe even because of poor management, they've linked out. And we need better signs. So the upper right is a sign from Indiana. That's a little bit better, right? It's giving you some information. But what we really need is a sign that says start here, stop here with whatever kind of maintenance you're doing. And we also need it in English and Spanish because a lot of this work is done by contract crews, and some of them, English is not their first language. So we have to develop some kind of signage that's better so that you can understand on the ground. We'd like to do something where you could be on ArcGIS online and it can tell you when to start and stop, but we're not there yet with the contractors. So if you don't have these areas marked, this is the kind of thing that can happen. This is a Georgia protected species that was in the right of way. It's a small shrub, easy to miss. It was completely removed during some really poor roadside maintenance. And that was because it wasn't marked. Nobody knew it was there until they went to look for it and realized it wasn't there anymore. So when we're talking about wildlife and DOTs, probably one of the things you're thinking about is wildlife vehicle collisions, which is something that's really, you talk about a lot. That's what you think about when you think about wildlife on roadways. And you can see in Georgia, the two of the top four most harmful events are related to wildlife or animals of some kind. And so that's not really surprising. And when you consider how many of these collisions are impactful to drivers, it's like 1 to 2 million a year with 26,000 injuries, 200 fatalities. And in 2008, these stats are a little old. It was $8 billion. It's certainly more than that. Yesterday, the article said 10, I think. They updated it to current times, but it's a lot of money. And those are really only reported, the ones that are causing damage that people actually report. We know it's underreported and it's pretty hard to estimate. And one thing that we have no idea how to estimate is the impacts on high priority wildlife. One of the stats in the article yesterday was that they thought there might be 1 million animals killed each day on roads in the US. I have no idea where that came from. It was an NPR article, but I was like, if that's true, I mean, maybe they're talking about insects too. I don't know, but it's a lot of animals. And with things like high priority snakes, like this is a hognose snake and a pine snake, we get records incidentally of these sometimes, but like how many of these animals are being killed that we will never know? And where are the problems really? And how are we going to decide where they are? So one thing the article talks about, and that's gotten more traction lately, is wildlife crossings. And we need to evaluate data first. Do we have existing data to tell us where we might need some crossings? DOT has very limited data on deer. We have some on bear, but not very much. So we need to collect additional data from the public, especially, and also from contractors cleaning up roadkill to know where those hotspots are. We'd like to develop a public reporting system. There are already some of these that have been developed, but we have a lot of safety considerations. You don't want people to be on an app while they're driving and like pulling over in dangerous traffic to try to take a picture of roadkill animals. So you have to be really careful. We also need field evaluation of hotspots to determine, what is the actual issue? Can you see a clear area that's causing a problem in the spot? And then include those hotspots in those environmental review letters if we have them. So if their DOT's planning a project and we know that there's a roadkill hotspot, maybe they can plan a wildlife crossing early in the process so that they can include that in their road widening. and then assist them to develop those crossings to make sure they're effective. So that's really what we can do now because we are able to work with DOT more closely. There are apps already for roadkill reporting. This is one, the roadkill app. And it's pretty easy. You just push the button of the animal you think it is. Obviously, it's not going to be super, perfect because you're driving fast. And I like the little alien for other. I thought that was pretty good. But we would like to have something that's used nationally. Instead of having every state develop their own collection system, we would really like to do something that everyone in North America is using so we can all share the same data. And believe it or not, there's places that are really dedicated to this work. We have the Road Ecology Center at UC Davis, the Western Transportation Institute at the University of Montana. These are the real experts on transportation ecology, and they have done a lot of work already on wildlife crossings and how to evaluate areas that are impactful to wildlife. This is an example of an existing wildlife crossing. It's in a national park, so it's a little bit like nicer and fancier than maybe you might see in Georgia in the future. But the idea that you're providing something that's not super unnatural that will allow wildlife to cross safely and get over the roadway. There's a lot of considerations for wildlife crossings, and there's a lot of research happening right now about the best ways to develop them and to prevent causing other issues like the fences where they end could become an area where then it's just down from the crossing, you get another hot spot. So you have to really figure out how wildlife are going to do these and work to funnel them in the right way. And we do actually have a project ongoing that has been in the works for a long time to establish our first wildlife crossing in Georgia. And we have obviously black bears across the southeast. Our population in the mountains is doing really well. Our population in open swamp is doing really well, but the middle Georgia black bear population is very small. It's about 250 bears, and it's really isolated from the other two populations because we have so much habitat fragmentation. There's no way for those bears to really move between, so they're kind of stuck there. And there's a state route that goes between the main population of these bears, and DOT is planning to widen that. They've been planning this for a very long time, which is not unusual for transportation projects. It can take a long time. This particular roadway supports about 8,000 vehicles a day, so it's not a huge road, but it's getting bigger and it's getting more traffic. So early on in the process, over 10 years ago, DOT and DNR decided to work with UGA on a PhD project to track some bears and determine if this highway was a good candidate for a wildlife crossing. So this was kind of like, it was pretty forward thinking for DOT. And they also established a memorandum of understanding between DNR and DOT to say we would assist with monitoring before and after, using UGA probably to help us on the project, but to see how this project would work. So the PhD student did a lot of work on the bears in the area, and this is probably the thing you can really see how much this roadway is impacting these bears. Each dot color is a different bear, and you can see that that road cuts right through, and those bears do not like to cross it. So it's obviously having a major impact, and widening that roadway is only going to make those impacts worse. And they do cross the road, but they are very careful about it, and they do get hit at times when they cross. So clearly this was an area that could benefit from crossings, and the student identified 3 different locations where it was likely to have a good effect if we put in crossings, and kind of general schematic of what it will look like. These will be underpasses, I believe is what they're planning, and they're going to have as much natural vegetation as possible to funnel those bears into those underpasses so that they can safely travel across the road. The project was on hold forever, and then 2 weeks ago I got a call that said it was happening and it was they were going to let, which means they're going to start accepting bids in July. And I was just like, whoa, okay, all of a sudden. So now we're going to try to help to monitor those bears as this project gets underway and see if they actually use it by putting up camera traps to see if we can catch bears going through, potentially collaring some more bears and seeing how their movements change when these underpasses are put in. They're going to start with 2, and then they'll do an additional 3rd on another part of the roadway. So hopefully we'll learn something from those 2 before they put in the 3rd crossing. So that's a big charismatic species that's a little bit easier to look at. But most of our issues are probably at things that we really don't see that often. One example from Georgia is diamondback terrapin. This is a high priority species for us and it occurs all along our coastway. It occurs in South Carolina as well. Really in the extreme tidal areas, and you mostly see it in the tidal marshes. You'll see their heads pop up sometimes, but you really rarely ever see these guys, except for when the females come out of the water to get to high ground to lay their eggs. And this is from early May to mid-July. And that's when they're most vulnerable because they're coming out to find a place to lay eggs. And of course, these bright sunny spots with not a lot of vegetation, a lot of those are along roadways and cause major issues all along the coast. This example is from Tybee Island. And so this is the island, this is the causeway in red that connects Savannah to Tybee Island. And it has been monitored and it's estimated that 100 to 150 of these are hit by vehicles each year. And of course, most of these are female because they're coming up to lay their eggs. So this can have significant impacts to the nesting population. And this is just one causeway. You guys know we have causeways all along our coast. They're in similar conditions. And so there are these roadways that are barriers that are causing impacts to these populations. And it's really hard to monitor these guys. There's work going on to figure out how to do head counts in the marshes each year to see if we can monitor the populations, but there's definitely a lot of impact from the roadways. So this is actually a project I worked on when I first came to Georgia with an environmental review for some road work. They had these medians that they put in and they were solid, and obviously the turtles were trying to cross, then they get stuck and have to turn back around. So one little thing that we did was to put in the little holes so that at least if they were stuck on the road, they could go all the way through instead of getting, you know, crunched on the other side, not giving them a great chance, but at least it's something. And the other thing that we had done was put up signs. And recent work has shown that signs will work for a little bit. And then people are taking this commute every day and they see this sign and they don't pay attention after a couple of weeks. So it's not like suddenly you've been driving by this for a year and you're gonna be like, oh, it's May 1st, I gotta watch out. You know, like people don't notice. So one of the things that DOT has done based on some research and some investigation about the easiest ways to make improvements without actually changing the roadways is to put up signs that are more interactive. So even if you put lights around this sign that light up during the time periods, the time of day and the time of year and the tides where it's most likely that those turtles are going to be on the roadway, then people will actually slow down and pay attention. The same thing with the sign in the back. I think DOT has now established like 80 of these signs along the coast, and someone in Atlanta actually has to flip a switch so that they turn on, which seems ridiculous. Eventually they'll automate it so that it's connected to the tide and the time of day. But when the sign's on and it's a lighted sign, people actually notice. And there's not a lot of work yet that has, or the numbers haven't come through to see how much of an improvement it's made. But it's definitely something that in other studies have shown people will pay attention when the signs are only on during certain times of the year. Now, sometimes we might have to actually move wildlife out of the way. And this is a picture from some bats that we moved off of a bridge that was going to be demolished. It was a very small number of big brown bats. They're a very common bat. We were able to move them during cold weather and get them out of the way so they could tear the bridge down. Obviously not what you want to be doing all the time, but occasionally you have to move wildlife. And you can imagine that roadways have a lot of impact on aquatic species. You probably think more about it with erosion and sedimentation into streams because of the clearing of the roadsides, just like some of those pictures. That's definitely a big impact. But there is direct impact to aquatic species too when work has to be done in the stream bed. For instance, these bridge beds, when they have to be replaced or repaired, they may have to actually get equipment into the stream to do the work. So in those cases, we may have to do surveys to determine if there are especially freshwater mussels in the area, because we have a lot of rare freshwater mussels. The fish can kind of move out of the way. It doesn't mean it's not an impact, but they're actually more mobile than the mussels. So we will work with DOT to snorkel the area and determine if there are individuals within the footprint of the work. And then you may actually hand remove those individuals. Often they're marked and moved somewhere during the construction process where they're hopefully not going to be impacted. And then eventually they can recolonize into the area after the work is done. again, a lot of work, a lot of man hours, not ideal, but something that we do sometimes have to directly move wildlife. Another example is gopher tortoise. These guys are not federally protected yet. They're a candidate species. We have a candidate conservation agreement. So Georgia DOT has agreed that they're going to help protect these animals. They like to dig their burrows in bright sunny spots, and sometimes that's along the roadway. So if we have areas where we have gopher tortoises that are known near the roadway, like this example, we would go look for burrows that are within the footprint of the actual work that has to be done. And first you would start by scoping those burrows and seeing if they're occupied. If the burrow is not occupied by anything that's going to be impacted, then the burrows can be collapsed and the area can be fenced to keep the tortoises out. It is one thing, it's not too hard to keep the tortoises out once you put up a fence, but you have to get them out of the burrows. Sometimes they won't come out, you can't trap them, they're just going to stay. So in that case, you actually have to excavate them out of their burrows. You don't want to do this if you don't have to. Obviously, it takes a lot of work and time, and it is pretty dangerous because biologists has to get in there and try to recover the tortoise. They've done quite a bit of it. Luckily, we don't have to do it that often, but they have our biologists on site to help with tortoise relocations. We actually have a gopher tortoise biologist in Georgia that works directly with DOT to do this. And though we don't want to do it, if we can move the roadway a little bit to avoid it, we will if we can. But if we can't, it's much better than the alternative, which used to be just to fill those burrows in and entomb the tortoises and build a road. So we're not doing that anymore, but some places it's still happening. And even, until this species is federally protected, that's probably not going to change unless we work more closely to get people to understand that these tortoises need to be moved and not just plowed over. And with plants, obviously they don't move at all. So, well, not really, but if they're in an area, they can definitely be impacted. And we have some species with a pretty small range. This is a federally protected species that occurs in Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. The biggest part of its population is in Georgia, and we do have areas where it grows right next to the roadway. Now, normally it wouldn't like those maintained right-of-way conditions, but it could be in the unmaintained area that is still part of the right-of-way. And because we have so much growth, we're doing a lot of roadway widening. So in these cases, if there are plants right within the right-of-way or just adjacent, we may actually have to move them from that area. And that just involves digging them up. Now, most of the time, it's not the whole population, so you can at least protect the area where part of the plants are. If you can move the roadway at all, then we try to get DOT to do that, but if not, then our botanists and a lot of the volunteers from our Georgia Botanical Society will come out to rescue the plants. They'll transfer them to the botanical garden where they will propagate them and try to, add them to some of the more naturally occurring populations in the area on lands that are protected or likely protected in the future. So again, it's not ideal, but we can at least move these plants without having them populations completely lost because of the transportation. Now I am going to talk about bats, but I just wanted to give you an overview of many other things before I got into it. If you guys have ever been to Austin, Texas, it's probably the place where people know the most about bats and a bridge. They have a bridge with over 1 million bats. There's a lot there. People go to see it. And we really didn't think that, the Southeast had that many bats in their transportation structures before. We knew they were around. We didn't have any real ability to look for them on a large scale, but we were just like, well, if DOT finds them, we'll try to work to help out, but we just really didn't know. And then white nose syndrome came, and we started to have more issues with bats that were previously common that were getting sick. I'm not going to talk about white nose syndrome. You guys better know a lot about it already. So because of white nose syndrome and because of other species that kind of had some range changes we weren't aware of, suddenly we had to look for bats in transportation structures. And when we started looking, we found them everywhere. And it really was the fact that we hadn't really looked, we didn't really know where to look. And once we looked, we realized, okay, we thought maybe we had them in 10%, then it was kind of up closer to 15% of structures. The more structures we look at, the more bats we find. And sometimes it's just a few, but we do have areas where we have considerable numbers. of bats using transportation structures. Most of the time in the summer, that's bridges, but in the winter time, we actually find them a lot in culverts. And you can see on the map, the red dots are where we have found bats, and the blue dots are where we did not find them. In the southern part of the state, we find them in a lot of areas, and obviously these surveys are focused on the large transportation corridors that are likely to have larger culverts that are more cave-like that can support more bats. We have them in areas that are very small as well, but this is where we focus most of our early surveys. Not only have we found bats, including the tricolored bat, which is the one we're most focused on in these culverts, but we've also found Pseudogymnostus destructans, the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, in those light gray counties, outside of the dark gray counties where we actually have white nose syndrome in our caves. So we're starting to see the fungus. Every year we add another county or two where we don't actually see it growing, but we swab and we detect the fungus on swabs. So we're seeing that they're moving, the fungus is moving into these transportation structures, and we're definitely concerned about them because in the wintertime, especially during the coldest period, we find bats in a lot of culverts in the southern part of the state where we don't have a lot of caves. So we have gotten a white nose syndrome research grant. Emily Farrell is working on her master's while she's a full-time DNR biologist. So that's rough, let me tell you. And she is looking at how the body condition of the bats is different. Basically, are they bigger in the caves early in the winter because they're staying in them longer? Are they using our culverts year round? Or are they just popping in the coldest periods to be protected from the really cold weather and not developing white nose syndrome? We have not seen white nose syndrome yet. We did find a few dead bats this week in some culverts, but we've had very cold temperatures and we think they froze, but we collected some of them for testing. I don't know, they might be too mushy, but we're gonna try. And we've been swabbing. We have not seen any white fungus on the bats' noses, but we're looking every year to try to determine how white nose impacts them in these areas. But the most important thing from all this work is that DOT now considers bats along with birds, which have always been protected by the Migratory Bird Act and have, DOT's always had to look for them in structures before they did work and remove them from structures before they did work. But now they did the same thing with bats. They're out there anyway, so it really is something that didn't add a whole lot, but has really helped us to understand where we have bats and we might have problems. And we also discovered that people don't know how to look for bats. So when we had these contractors that were doing work, the ecological consultants didn't have a lot of bat experience. There aren't that many consultants that are bat consultants. So we needed to train the people that were out looking at these roadways so that they knew what to look for when they were looking for bats. And that's been really helpful to train both the agency staff as well as the consultants so that we know that they're actually doing a good job with these surveys and actually identifying the areas where we're going to have impacts. And we had our first issue this winter where we had an emergency culvert repair in an area where we had bats hibernating. And we usually don't have a lot of culvert work in the winter, so it hasn't been too much of a problem yet. But in this case, this culvert was going to fall soon, so they had to do the work. And we worked with some consultants that helped to put up exclusion devices. It was very concerned about what would happen if it flooded, but we got really lucky. They were able to do the project really quickly. But DOT worked with us to let us know when the work was going to begin, make sure we could survey the area for the bats before the work and remove any that were still there before they actually did the repairs. And then they can take down the screens. And there were structures nearby that the bats could use while this was being repaired. So it's, again, not ideal to have to move wildlife, but it's much better that we knew they were there and we were able to move them before they did the repairs and potentially harm the bats. And then Susan and David and probably Eric have already seen this little presentation, but it is one example of how we were able to work directly on a project that could have been a really big problem, but because DOT was willing to work with us on it, we were able to learn a lot from a maintenance project where there were bats on a bridge. This is I-75 north of Atlanta. It is 6 lanes across, and this bridge is unique because there's no gap in between the north and southbound lanes. So the north and southbound lanes come together, and there's a long longitudinal joint along the bridge. You can see underneath it's very dark and cave-like, And it gets about 76,000 cars every day. It's a lot. It's constant road noise. But it's a year-round bat roost, and we have thousands of them. You can see the guano that's coming off of this joint. They're in there all the time. We had a lot of time on this project, so we visited it every month of the year, and there were always bats there in lower numbers in the coolest part of the year. And the important thing is these bats are not a listed species. They are our most common bats that are found in transportation structures, big brown bats and three-tailed bats. And we were still able to work because it was a large maternity colony, and partly because in Georgia, all bats are protected from intentional harm. So we it would be hard to enforce it, but we try to get DOT to pay attention to all of them, and they do. So the bridge was originally part of a large resurfacing project, and I don't know if you guys are seeing this in South Carolina, but they're resurfacing all of our bridges to add some more rough texture to reduce the number of accidents in the rain. So they were going to do this all along I-75. When the bridge was found early in the process, it was removed from the large project so we could figure out what to do. DOT hates doing that, but they did it this time so we could really investigate potential solutions to this problem, which is going to happen again. The biggest problem with DOT projects, you'd like to say, don't do this work during this time of the year ever, because it's going to be negative impact. But you have to have certain temperatures to do some of the work because epoxy won't set below a certain temperature or above a certain temperature. So there's other restrictions that make it hard to put these blanket seasonal restrictions on the work. And we had bats there year round, so there was no way there was any time of the year we could do it without impact. So DOT included special provisions in this project that required the contractors to call us when they were starting work so we could be on site, either us or Fish and Wildlife Service, to figure out what the bats were doing while they were doing this work and see how we could prevent harm. And they couldn't complete it during the maternity season, which in Georgia is April 1st through July 31st. So we came up with some modifications to their maintenance plan. When bridges are built, they have joints in them to allow them to flex, right, with the temperature changes, so that the concrete doesn't crack. You have to have that ability. And so these joints are filled with something that is called backer rod. And this backer rod is covered with pop. So when they start replacing these joints, they usually use this giant saw to cut through it. We knew the bats were right there, so we asked them to do it with box cutters by hand. We also asked them when they initially pull those joints out, usually the backer rod looks like a pool noodle, which is why that's what we refer to it as. This foam thing is often degraded, but they pull it all out and then they usually leave the joint wide open before they remove the surface with shot glass. Obviously, if that joint is wide open and they're shooting shot onto the surface, that's going to go into the joint and hurt those bats. So we asked them to put an extra piece of pool noodle over the bats and, believe it or not, cover it with giant duct tape while they were doing this resurfacing to protect the bats in the joints. And then after they do the shot blasting, they put epoxy and like a crushed gravel mixture on top to make the surface more rough and safer for travel. Then they would pull that temporary backer rod out and again hand trim instead of using giant saws the joints, because they need concrete to attach to push the new backer rod in, which we asked them just to put it on the top and not push it down too far, and then they can cover it with caulk, and then they're done with the project. So obviously there's some changes, but it's nothing really major. We're just asking them to take a little more time and care. So I do have sound on this one so you can hear how loud this road is. It's just a constant lump of traffic. These are three-tailed bats, and they were hand removing that joint. I told that guy to wear gloves, but he did not listen. But the bats are right up at the top. Now, I was worried they were going to start flying out onto the roadway and get hit, but they didn't. I think they've been at this bridge long enough. They know not to fly up onto I-75. That's a bad choice. So really, after we removed the joints, they just sort of hung out. They were obviously irritated, but they weren't going anywhere. So we continued with the process and pulled all the joints out and added the additional backer rod to the top. But we couldn't get those bats to move. Like, this was warm weather. It was at night and they would not get out of the way. So I had to use a yardstick to push them out so that we could get the baccarat in on top of them to protect them from the shot blasting. They were so stubborn. And I mean, you know, I was trying to be really careful and do this in the middle of the night on I-75, the traffic like going like crazy. And so I had someone under the bridge at all times to watch to make sure these bats weren't like falling onto the pavement, because there's another road under the bridge. It's not very busy, but that person watched, and all the bats that I had to move out of the way, which it wasn't that many that wouldn't budge at all, flew away. We didn't see any of them having any trouble because they were awake and it was warm, and they were able to actually put the cock over the top and finish the project. And believe it or not, we saw no sign of injury to bats on this project. Like, obviously they were disturbed, but they're living on a bridge with all those cars, and they're like, where the joints were being replaced, they were already, their faces were up on I-75 before they did this. You could see them if you walked along the roadway, like they're just used to disturbance here. After this project was finished, they were back the next day, and they didn't seem to care. In fact, they were right up on that baccarat that was put back in there. And then by the summertime, they came back in the numbers that they had started in. And this allowed us to have a new policy for completing maintenance like this. And it was really a good example because they let us be on site, and I was watching the construction guys. It was very hands-on and an interesting job for sure. But we were able to do it because they let us have these provisions so that we could help move these bats out of the way. And we wanted to make sure DOT got credit for this because they didn't have to do it. And so we worked with their press department and released some press. And I was a little worried that people were going to say, oh, great, DOT's wasting more money on protecting bats. Like, who cares? They loved it. I mean, it got so much positive press. Even the people at the top of DOT that really don't like ecology said that they were amazed at how many people were commenting about it. So it was really positive for them. And in general, when you talk to people about wildlife and protecting wildlife in all areas, they're supportive. And an example that we've had recently in Georgia is our Georgia Outdoor Stewardship Program. In 2018, Georgia voted on an amendment to protect parks, trails, other lands and waters and wildlife spaces. And this had been done before. We were really concerned, and this current political climate that was not going to pass. This bill passed with 83% support in Georgia. Like, it was unbelievable that we had that much support. And it's one of the things that I think about a lot when I'm looking at transportation projects and all the impacts we're having because of population growth and all the changes. I know that our population really supports wildlife and wild places. And when you ask them, they do value it, and even more since the pandemic because people relied on it so much during that time. So the take home is that we can, even though overall transportation expansion is a negative thing to natural areas and natural resources, we can work together to try to minimize the impacts. And we do have support from the public, and now we have more dedicated funding to actually do this work. And it's not going to change. We've got areas where our wildlife are dependent on stuff that we put onto the landscape. And we have to make sure that we're paying attention to them as we're maintaining it and expanding our footprint in transportation. And I just wanted to say thank you. And I have to thank Susan because I'm so glad that you came. She's been a mentor to me since I moved to the Southeast. She was so helpful when I came here and didn't know anything, was terrified about this new job I had taken. And I really love working with her, and I really thank you, Susan. And for all of you guys coming to the presentation. And I'm happy to take any questions that you
So given the growing importance of environmental concerns in society today, how that's going to affect our future, I guess you use South Carolina as an example of a state that's maybe less actively focused on those areas. So what advice would you have for those of us entering into this field to help bring about those changes in a positive way, to help grow that, I guess, just that communication of this,
Yeah.
to bring around that public change to the department?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the most important thing for you to do is to be hopeful and positive that we can continue to make changes, despite the fact that when you start working in this field, it's going to be overwhelming and sometimes very depressing to see what impacts we're having on wildlife. But I think you had mentioned communication. To me, that's the biggest thing. Just figuring out who is making these decisions, who needs to get your input, who can you help without being like, I know what you need to do and it's this. Be like, how can I help inform your process? How can I help you to get more done? A lot of the ecologists working on these projects would really like to do more to protect wildlife, to enhance roadside habitats, to establish more crossings, but they just have limited resources, especially in places like South Carolina. So it's really kind of trying to figure out where you can make an impact and help without being pushy. And as an agency person, for me, I'm in a much better place than Fish and Wildlife because I'm not a regulatory agency. I can't actually tell them what to do. What we're doing is providing assistance to them to make better decisions and helping them to, these projects have to be done. You know, I'm under bridges all the time that look like they're about to fall down. So I really know that DOT needs to work on them. Instead of saying, you can't do this, this is going to have a negative impact. You have to say, how can we minimize the impacts and move forward? You have to accept some level of impact, but try to make up for it, whether it's mitigation, which DOT does, like buying some property and preserving it for the animals that they're disturbing. Not ideal, but there's lots of ways that you can potentially help. So it's really being open-minded and communicating and not trying to be very, to stop everything that's happening, because transportation expansion is not going to stop. We have to do it in a smarter way and a better way for the wildlife.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, is there any research or have you thought about trying to get research going on how to improve culverts or redesign
Yeah.
for like that?
Yeah, so for fish passage has been a really big focus of culverts, but we actually have a new stream guidance for culvert structures that includes bat surveys. And they actually asked us if we thought that they could add more habitat for bats. And basically, you know, I think there are some people working on ways that you can modify culverts. There's definitely people working on bridges, and I didn't include it here, but they just built a bridge in Kentucky for gray bats that was successful, replacing an old bridge that had a colony, and they redesigned a new bridge to provide more bat habitat. So that was exciting. They've done that in Europe before. They, you know, most of the time in the US it's been accidental, but because of the focus currently on providing habitat for wildlife, it is a little bit more, DOTs are a little more open-minded. They've always been reluctant because once you get wildlife on a structure, then you have to always deal with them when you're doing any maintenance or anything. But they're finding out that it doesn't matter if we make the structure for them, they're going to be on some level of structure. So if we can put them in a certain area that they're intended to be, it can be better than if they're just everywhere and every little crack and crevice. So you can easily design crevice routes for bats and culverts, but most of the culverts already provide enough of the area for the bats to use. But yeah, there's a lot of research on improving structures for wildlife currently. There's a lot of ideas. It's not really that hard to do it. It's getting DOTs to actually want to do it. That's the problem. Anybody else?
So with the new infrastructure bill, that's all we hear about. I mean, there are going to be projects everywhere.
Yep.
Are you guys going to even be able to?
Yeah, it's going to be hard. We're actually going to hire another biologist to work on environmental reviews. So we'll have 3 full-time biologists that do nothing but review projects and communicate with DOT on how to reduce impacts. They do a little bit more about like, that's their main job. It's probably not going to be enough for the project reviews that are coming in. And it is, I mean, we know they're going to ramp it up, but because we do get DOT funding and our funding agreement is up in June, so we're going to have a new one. They're going to give us more money. I mean, DOTs have a lot of money. It's getting them to be able to focus it in the right way. And I mean, South Carolina, clearly their roads are terrible. You guys, it's awful. Every time I go to the coast, I'm like, whoa. I don't know what's going on, but they definitely need to figure out how to get some of the money, more money into the state, even for wildlife stuff. Like we tried to get South Carolina to join us in a grant to do work on transportation structures, and they wouldn't participate, even though though we weren't even asking for money, our DOT said they would give all the money, but it didn't matter, they wouldn't participate, so that's the hard part, and I don't know how to change it other than Jim's making a few inroads with some people. Nick Sharp's doing the same thing in Atlanta, you know, trying to personally communicate with people, these ecologists that can oftentimes in the states where they haven't focused on habitats and species very much, they're beat down, like they're told every day, all you're supposed to do is move these projects forward. We don't care about the environmental stuff. That's just a like check on a sheet that we have to do. And that is really unfortunate when it gets to that point. I think because Federal Highways is providing more funding, hopefully there'll be a little bit more. I mean, our Federal Highways makes DOT2 stuff, but it seems like South Carolina just doesn't have that.
And maybe listing of tricolors.
Yeah, new species getting listed that are statewide is definitely gonna have an impact. And you can see Alabama just released they wanted more bat surveys on their bridges. That's the first time they've actually paid anyone to do it. Because I think they're suddenly like, uh-oh, like this could really be bad. Because if we get a new bat listed that's statewide for these southeastern states, they've never had that before. So yeah, it's frustrating to see how different it is between states. And the western states are much better, but they've got a whole different set of issues. Anyone else?
You have to do a lot with animals that return to the same site, the
Yeah.
same exact site. Like, how do you, if you need to like temporarily relocate them or permanently relocate them?
Yeah.
How do you deal with that?
There are situations where we can hold animals if we have to, like it's rare, but like, you know, if we have to rescue an animal off of a situation, we have some wildlife facilities that maybe can hold them. We have to be very careful because we don't want to introduce any disease into those animals when they release them in the wild. Often we are just going to temporarily block. So say with bats, we might put one of those pool noodles in the bottom of the crevice the bats are using, seal up the edges while the work's being done. We had to do this on a project where they were spraying the underside of the bridge because they were going to spray up into those crevices. So we blocked them out temporarily, obviously not during the maternity season. And then once the work was done, removed those temporary blocks and they come back. We generally see that on these routes. We have not done that work a lot with some of our more, I don't know, species that are more easily disturbed because we don't have that many on our bridges. But I'm actually working on a project that's a national project to look at national guidance for bats and bridges. And they're going to try to focus on some of these species, like maybe some of the bridges with Indiana bats, gray bats, to see if they respond differently so we can see if we need different guidance. But yeah, usually it's just temporarily trying to move the species and then let them come back. And, you know, the problem is you're really at the subject of the the weather. It's the weather. Like if the weather gets bad and they can't do the project, then you may be really delayed. And so it's the communication is really important to make sure that we're not going in and excluding stuff until they're about ready to do the work, and then we can let animals back in as soon as they're done. Got something else?
Yeah, kind of, it was something I was trying to think about, I think we're all in the same boat where like we care about what we're doing, and wanting to see the community as a whole successful. It sounds like a lot of the shortcomings of departments or states that don't have these more open-minded initiatives, sounds like it's maybe due to lack of, I guess, education in our legislation side of things. So like with this transportation bill that's coming through, do you think that's something that would be, I guess, that many of us should maybe put more focus on, is like the legislative side to actually impart these impacts and these changes for this community that is able to supply this data and this information?
Yeah, it's really about changing people's viewpoints and getting them to understand, especially if they understand that the voters care. That's kind of a way to think about it, and making them really get that when you do the right thing for wildlife, people in your state will respond positively. You can see that from, I'm sure you guys have seen the videos of wildlife crossings where there's like, have you seen the one with the fox and the badger? Because if you haven't seen that, you need to look at it. It's adorable. And they're like getting ready to go hunt, and they're all excited to go under this roadway on this wildlife passage. That thing is so popular because people love to see it. So if you can get a project to happen, get some positive feedback, get some positive press, and then make sure you're engaging the people that are the decision makers. And sometimes that involves taking them out and showing them stuff. Like I've taken people out and their kid is with them, and the kid is like, Dad, you've got to do this. Like this, don't hurt these animals. You know, one little thing can kind of change the trajectory and make people understand. And because there's dedicated funding for this now, it's the time to do it, right? Because we have set aside funding for protecting wildlife and transportation corridors. We have a lot more funding available than we did before. And so we need to make sure that this is part of the planning process and in states where they're not paying attention. Yeah, so it's engaging people and it is education, getting them to understand that is something that's supported broadly in the state. Even, I mean, people love bats, they like snakes, even though they don't want them around there, they don't want them squished most of the time, getting better. Bats used to be like, kill them all, now everybody's like, save the bats. So we're just trying to change people's minds and get them more exposure, and then let everybody know that the public supports this. That's really important.
We might want to check the chat.
Oh, yeah.
Any last questions? We do have a lunch. It's going to be outside. So if you go down to the lobby of Wahatski in the courtyard right there, I actually don't know what she ordered for today, but there will be food. And I think that's it. Thank you guys for coming. There are sign-in sheets for undergrad and for the class if you haven't signed in yet.
I should kind of.
We are definitely lacking anything that's under fish. Well, we have less funding for that. Yeah, and our salary is not very good. So we're having a lot